The air in the Dust Devil Creek saloon is thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and something fouler, anticipation. It coils in the smoke-hazed light, a greasy film on every surface. On a makeshift stage, little more than 3 whiskey barrels with a plank laid across them, a woman stands. Her name is Eleanor Vance, and she is for sale. The stagecoach that brought her here, carrying her hopes in a single worn valise, also carried the news that broke them. Her intended, a merchant named Silas Croft, had been claimed by a fever 3 days prior. The ink on their mail-order bride contract was barely dry, and now so was he. The town council, led by the portly and pompous Mayor Thompson, saw not a tragedy, but an accounting problem. Croft had paid for her passage. The town, in its own grasping way, felt entitled to a return on the deceased's investment. So they are auctioning her contract. Auctioning her. Eleanor keeps her eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards, a dark, swirling pattern that feels like the inside of her own chest. The auctioneer, a man whose voice is better suited to selling cattle, bellows out the terms. A strong back for field work. A woman's touch for a lonely home. We'll start the bidding for Mr. Croft's contract. Good for 1 year's labor as written. A low murmur ripples through the crowd of dusty, sun-beaten men. Their gazes are heavy, assessing. She is livestock. She is property. From the corner of the room, where the shadows cling like old cobwebs, a man watches. He is separate from the greedy energy of the room, a pillar of stillness in the shifting tide of men. This is Sheriff Jedediah Stone, a man more myth than neighbor, known for his long silences and the haunted look in his gray eyes. He came because he heard the commotion, because it was his job to prevent outright murder, but this spectacle feels perilously close to it. He sees the fine tremor in the woman's hands, the rigid set of her spine. He sees not an asset to be claimed, but a person being broken. The bidding starts low, a cruel joke. A handful of coins, a wave of mocking laughter, then a serious bid from a grimy rancher with missing teeth, and another from a known brute who works the livery. The price climbs a ladder of indignities. And then a voice cuts through the grime and greed, as sharp and cold as well water. $50. The saloon falls silent. Every head turns toward the shadows. Sheriff Stone steps forward, just enough for the lamplight to catch the silver of his badge and the hard line of his jaw. $50 is a fortune. It is more than the contract is worth, more than any man in the room would pay for a year's labor, no matter how desperate. It is not a bid, it is a declaration. The auctioneer, stunned, looks from the sheriff to Mayor Thompson, who glares back, his face purpling with indignation. But no one dares counter the sheriff. His reputation is built on an economy of words and an abundance of action. He doesn't make idle threats or idle bids. Sold. The auctioneer finally croaks, pointing a trembling finger. To the sheriff, Jedediah Stone's eyes meet Eleanor's for the first time. They are not kind, not cruel, simply resolved. He gives a curt nod, not to the auctioneer, but to her. He has not bought a laborer. He has claimed a responsibility he doesn't want, for reasons he has yet to understand himself. And with that single decisive act, the quiet, empty life of the reclusive sheriff and the terrified, shattered life of the mail-order bride are now bound together by a piece of paper bought in a dusty, merciless saloon. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The journey from the saloon to the sheriff's office was a walk of 100 yards that felt like 1,000 miles. Jedediah Stone walked a pace ahead of her, not out of discourtesy, but as if to cleave a path through the stairs. The townsfolk of Dust Devil Creek, drawn out by the sudden silence from the saloon, lined the dusty street like vultures perched on a fence. Their eyes followed Eleanor, stripping her bare of dignity all over again. They whispered behind their hands, the women's faces tight with scorn, the men's a mixture of thwarted desire and mocking curiosity. She was the auction woman, the sheriff's property. Jed did not look at them. He kept his gaze fixed forward, his broad back a shield she could not yet bring herself to trust. His office was the last building on the main street, a squat structure of sun-bleached wood with 2 windows that stared out at the endless, unforgiving expanse of the plains like vacant eyes. A sign, its paint faded and peeling, read Sheriff above the door. Next to it, 3 iron-barred windows marked the town's jail cells. This was to be her new home. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He pushed the door open and stood aside, a silent invitation for her to enter. The air inside was cool and smelled of dust, old paper, and the faint, clean scent of cedar. It was a place of stark utility. One room served as the office, dominated by a heavy wooden desk cluttered with wanted posters and official-looking documents. A gun rack hung on the wall, its rifles gleaming dully in the low light. Beyond a small partition was a living space that was even more Spartan. A narrow cot covered with a single gray blanket, a small cast-iron stove, a table with 1 chair, and a rough-hewn shelf holding a few tins of beans, a bag of coffee, and a chipped enamel plate. It was the home of a man who did not live, but merely existed. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway, clutching her valise, the only thing in the world that was truly hers. She felt like a stray dog he had taken in, uncertain of where to stand or what was expected of her. Jed broke the silence, his voice a low rumble. "The cot is yours." He didn't look at her as he said it. He moved to the stove, his movements economical and practiced. He took a log from the wood box and placed it inside, his attention seemingly focused on the task, but she knew he was intensely aware of her presence, of the disruption she represented. Thank you, Sheriff," she managed, her voice thin and reedy. He grunted in acknowledgement. He would sleep in the chair, or perhaps on the floor of one of the empty cells. The thought was both a comfort and a fresh source of shame. He had paid $50 for her contract, a sum that could have bought him a good horse, and now he was giving up his own bed. She was a burden he had inexplicably chosen to shoulder. She watched him, trying to read the man who now held her fate in his hands. He was tall, leaner than he had seemed in the saloon's gloom, with the kind of sinewy strength that came from a hard life, not from brute force. His dark hair was threaded with gray at the temples, and lines were etched around his eyes and mouth, lines of sorrow more than age. He moved with a quiet purpose that was intimidating, yet there was nothing in his manner that suggested the leering cruelty of the man at the auction. He was a closed book, its cover made of leather and steel. That first night, the silence was a living thing. It filled the small room, pressing in on them. Eleanor lay on the cot, fully dressed, her body rigid with a fear that refused to recede. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside, sent a jolt through her. She listened to the sound of his breathing from the chair by the desk, a steady, rhythmic sound that was the only anchor in the terrifying new reality of her life. She thought of her home back in Ohio, of the cramped, joyless house she had been so desperate to escape. She had dreamed of a new life in the West, a life of her own, making with a husband she hoped would be kind. She had traded one cage for another, and this one felt infinitely more lonely and precarious. Jed sat in the darkness, the $50 contract on the desk beside him. He could feel her fear across the room. It was a palpable presence, sharp as the scent of ozone before storm. He didn't know why he'd done it. When he heard the auctioneer's call, something ancient and deeply buried inside him had broken loose, a dam of grief and solitude he had spent years constructing. He had lost his own wife and daughter to a cholera outbreak 5 years ago, and with them, he had lost his capacity for connection. He'd taken the sheriff's job in Dust Devil Creek because it was a place where no one asked questions, a place where a man could be alone with his ghosts. Now, he had brought another soul into his hermitage, a young woman whose eyes held a different, but no less profound, kind of haunting. He had acted on an impulse, a raw, protective instinct he thought had died with his family. Now, in the quiet of the night, doubt began to creep in. Mayor Thompson would not let this go. The town was a tinderbox of gossip and resentment, and he had just struck the match. He had not solved the woman's problem. He had merely made it his own. He looked over at the small, still form on the cot. He had a duty to the law, but this felt like a duty to something else entirely. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a flicker of human decency. And he was terrified of what it would cost him. The first days fell into a pattern of unspoken rules and careful distances. Eleanor rose before the sun, her movements soft as a mouse's scurry, trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. She found a broom and swept the floors, clearing away layers of dust that seemed as old as the town itself. She took the sad, meager contents of Jed's larder and, with a skill born of making much from little, produced meals that were simple but nourishing. She would set a plate on the table for him, then retreat to the far side of the room to eat her own portion, her eyes downcast. Jed accepted these small domestic offerings with the same stoic silence. He would eat what she prepared, his expression unreadable, then rise and deposit the clean plate on the shelf before heading out on his duties. He never said thank you, but he started leaving a small sack of flour or a few potatoes on the table in the evenings, procured from the general store under the wary eye of its proprietor. They were transactions, not conversations. Flour for stew, a mended shirt for a roof over her head. They were building a life together, one silent barter at a time. Her fear began to slowly, cautiously, give way to a state of watchful waiting. The sheriff was a man of profound and unshakable routine. He was predictable, and for a woman whose life had been thrown into utter chaos, predictability was a form of safety. He never raised his voice. His gaze, when it fell upon her, was distant but never unkind. He treated her not as a servant, but as a piece of furniture he was still learning to navigate around. One afternoon, a drunkard, one of the men who had bid on her at the saloon, stumbled up to the office door. He rattled the handle, his voice thick and slurred. "Sheriff, I want to talk to your new acquisition. Just want to be neighborly." Eleanor froze, the dishcloth in her hand turning to stone. The memory of the auction, the leering faces, the humiliation, came rushing back, hot and suffocating. Before she could even retreat further into the shadows of the living quarters, Jed was at the door. He didn't open it all the way, just a crack, his body blocking the opening entirely. He said nothing. He simply looked at the man. Eleanor couldn't see his face, but she saw the drunkard's bravado melt away like snow in the sun. He stammered an apology, backed away, and practically fled down the street. Jed closed the door with a quiet click. He didn't mention the incident, but the message was clear. Here, in this small, dusty office, she was safe. He was her protector. The realization was as unsettling as it was comforting. A week after her arrival, the first true test of their arrangement came not from a drunkard, but from Mayor Thompson himself. He appeared at the office door, flanked by two other members of the town council, their faces stern and self-important. "Sheriff," Thompson began, his voice oozing a false sincerity that made Eleanor's skin crawl. She was mending one of Jed's shirts by the weak light of the back window, and she kept her head bowed, trying to become invisible. "Thompson," Jed replied, his tone flat. He did not invite them in. "The council has been discussing your situation," the mayor continued, pointedly looking past Jed to where Eleanor Saturday. "It's a matter of public decency. It isn't proper, a young woman living here with you in the jailhouse. It sets a poor example. She needed a place to stay. She has one," Jed said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "She has a contract." Another councilman, a sour-faced man named Henderson, piped up, "A contract for labor. We have ranchers who would be willing to take it off your hands, Sheriff. For a fair price, of course. Put her to good, honest work instead of whatever this is." The implication hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Eleanor's needle stilled. Her cheeks burned with shame. Jed's posture didn't change, but a cold stillness settled over him. "The contract is mine. I paid for it. The matter is settled." "Is it?" Thompson challenged, his chins wobbling with indignation. "The people of Dust Devil Creek value propriety, Sheriff. They elected you to uphold the law, not to flout its spirit. We expect you to resolve this situation in a way that is satisfactory to the community. It was a veiled threat, and everyone present knew it. Resolve it, or we will resolve you. Jed's hand rested on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip. It wasn't a threat, just a habit, but it had the desired effect. The councilman shifted uncomfortably. The situation, Jed said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout, is resolved. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. He closed the door on their sputtering protests. The silence that fell in the room was heavier than before. Eleanor kept her eyes on her sewing, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had defended her. He had stood against the most powerful men in town for her. She dared to glance up at him. He was standing with his back to her, looking out the front window at the retreating forms of the councilman. His shoulders were rigid with tension. She saw then that his protection came at a cost he was paying every time he stood between her and the town's venom. Later that evening, as she was preparing a sparse meal of beans and bacon, her hand brushed against a stack of papers on the corner of his desk. A single sheet fell to the floor. She bent to retrieve it and saw it was a legal document, a property deed. Her eyes, trained by a father who had prized literacy above all else, scanned the page. She could read it, not just haltingly like most women she knew, but fluently. It was a skill she had always kept quiet about, as it was often seen as an unnecessary and even prideful accomplishment for a woman. Jed turned from cleaning a rifle and saw her with the paper in her hand. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his face. "What is it?" It fell," she stammered, holding it out to him. "I was just picking it up." He took it from her, his gaze lingering on her face. "You can read that." She nodded, her eyes falling to the floor. "Yes, Sheriff. My father was a schoolteacher." He was silent for a long moment. He looked from the document to her, and for the first time, his expression was not one of distant observation, but of genuine assessment. He seemed to be seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time, not as a problem, not as a contract, but as a person with a history and abilities he hadn't suspected. "I see," he said, and the words, though simple, felt like a shift in the very ground beneath her feet. He placed the deed back on the desk, and then did something unprecedented. He pulled the single chair out from the table. "Sit," he said, not as a command, but as a quiet invitation. He then fetched an empty crate from a corner, appended it, and sat on it himself. For the first time, they ate their meal at the same table, facing each other in the growing twilight. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space, a quiet territory they were beginning to navigate together. Their fragile domesticity began to take on a strange, quiet rhythm. The town's hostility was a constant, simmering pressure, but within the walls of the sheriff's office, a delicate ecosystem of mutual reliance was forming. Eleanor's days were filled with small acts of creation. She turned a stained flour sack into a passable window curtain, bringing a soft, filtered light into the grim main room. She found a patch of stubborn weeds behind the jailhouse, and, with a determination that surprised even herself, began to till the hard-packed earth, hoping to coax a few vegetables from the unforgiving soil. These were not the duties of a contracted laborer. They were the acts of a woman trying to build a home, however precarious. Jed, in turn, began to change in subtle ways. He started speaking to her more, not in long conversations, but in short, declarative sentences that were, for him, a torrent of communication. "Storm's coming," he would say, and she would know to bring in the washing. "Circuit judge arrives Tuesday," and she would understand he would be occupied and tense. One evening, he came back with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it on the table without a word. Inside were 2 bright red ribbons. They were the first beautiful, non-essential thing she had seen since arriving in Dust Devil Creek. She didn't know how to thank him, so she simply tied one in her hair the next morning. When he saw it, a brief, almost imperceptible softening occurred around his eyes before his usual mask of stoicism settled back into place. Their greatest discoveries about each other came through observation. She learned the source of his hauntedness one rainy afternoon when she was organizing a small, dusty box of his personal effects she'd found under the cot. Tucked at the very bottom was a small, tin-type photograph, its edges worn smooth from handling. It showed a smiling woman with kind eyes, her arm around a little girl with a gap-toothed grin. Jed entered the room just as she was looking at it. She froze, expecting an explosion of anger at her intrusion. He stopped dead in the doorway, his face draining of color. The air crackled with a sudden, raw grief. Eleanor quickly and gently placed the photograph back in the box, her heart aching for him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was just tidying." He didn't answer for a long time. He walked over to the window and stared out at the rain streaking down the pane, his back a wall of impenetrable sorrow. "Her name was Sarah," he finally said, his voice thick. The little one was Lily. The cholera took them both. 5 years ago, he had shared the core of his pain with her. It was a trust she had not asked for, but felt deeply. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply accepted his grief, allowing it to exist in the space between them. Later that day, she made him a cup of coffee, just the way he liked it, and set it on the desk beside him. It was a small gesture, but it was all she had to give. It meant, "I see your pain. You're not alone in it now." He, in turn, discovered more of her. He came to rely on her clear handwriting and quick mind. He started leaving stacks of paperwork on the table, requisitions, reports to the territorial government, and she would organize and copy them for him, her script elegant and precise. He realized she was not just literate, she was intelligent. He began to ask for her opinion. "This request from the Bar T Ranch," he'd ask, pushing a paper towards her. "Does it read as legitimate need or simple greed?" She would read it carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The wording feels grasping, Sheriff." He uses the word entitled 3 times. He would grunt, a sound she was beginning to interpret as agreement and respect. He started calling her Eleanor, not just in his head but out loud. The sound of her own name, spoken not with contempt or as a line item on a contract, was a balm to her wounded spirit. The outside world, however, refused to let them be. Mayor Thompson and his cronies grew bolder. The whispers became open taunts. When Eleanor went to the general store, the proprietor would serve her last, making her wait while other women shot her looks of pure venom. They saw her as a threat to the town's rigid social order, a scarlet woman living in sin with the town's highest authority. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, considering they were the ones who had put her on the auction block. One market day, the situation escalated. A ranch hand, emboldened by liquor and the sneering encouragement of his friends, cornered Eleanor near the well. "Well now," he slurred, blocking her path. "If it ain't the sheriff's $50 prize. You too good for the rest of us now, are ya?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. She tried to step around him, but he moved with her, his sour breath washing over her face. "Come on now, don't be shy. The sheriff's an old man. A pretty thing like you must get lonely." He reached for her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a hand clamped down on his shoulder like a vice. Jed stood there, having appeared as if from the very dust of the street. His face was thunderous, his gray eyes chips of ice. "You have business with Miss Vance?" Jed's voice was dangerously quiet. The ranch hand paled, his drunken courage evaporating instantly. "And no, Sheriff. Just pass in the time of day. Pass it somewhere else," Jed ordered, his grip tightening until the man winced in pain. "And if I ever see you or any of your friends within 10 feet of her again, you'll be passing the time in one of my cells. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Sheriff. I understand," the man squeaked. Jed released him with a shove that sent him stumbling backward into his snickering friends. He then turned to Eleanor. His face was still hard, but his eyes were filled with a fierce, protective fire. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and a powerful, overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had not just defended her. He had publicly declared her as being under his personal protection. He had drawn a line in the sand for the entire town to see. He took the water buckets from her trembling hands. "Let's go home," he said. As they walked back to the office, the silence between them was different again. It was charged with the unspoken things that had just happened. The public threat, the public defense. For Eleanor, the fear she felt for her own safety was now tangled up with a new, more complicated fear for him. He was making powerful enemies on her behalf. She was no longer just a burden. She was a danger to him. And for Jed, the cold, calculated duty of a lawman was becoming hopelessly intertwined with the hot, impulsive instinct to protect this woman, to shield her from the ugliness of the world. He was no longer just upholding the law. He was defending his. He didn't have a word for what she was to him. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would rather face down the entire town than let anyone harm her. The sanctuary they had built was under siege, and the time for quiet accommodation was rapidly coming to an end. The confrontation at the well was the spark that lit the fuse. Mayor Thompson saw Jed's public defense of Eleanor not as an act of chivalry, but as a direct challenge to his authority and the town council's power. He couldn't abide a sheriff he couldn't control, especially one who was now, in his eyes, morally compromised. The whispers and taunts coalesced into an official, organized campaign. A week later, a formal summons was delivered to the sheriff's office. It wasn't a friendly visit this time. The council demanded Jed's presence at an emergency town meeting in the church, the only building large enough to hold the righteous fury Thompson was stoking. The subject was stated in cold, bureaucratic language, to address the ongoing issue of moral turpitude and the fitness of the sheriff to hold his office. Jed read the summons, his face impassive, but Eleanor saw the muscle jump in his jaw. This was it, the final move in Thompson's game. That evening, the air in their small home was thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor found she couldn't settle. She swept an already clean floor. She straightened books that were already neat. Finally, Jed looked up from the pistol he was cleaning, his movements methodical and sure. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cutting through her anxious energy. "Sit down." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the cot, her hands twisting in her lap. He laid the pistol aside and faced her directly, his gaze steady and serious. "You know what this meeting is about." She nodded. "They want to remove you from your position. Because of me." The words came out as a pained whisper. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest. "They are using you to get to me," he corrected her, his tone firm. "Thompson has wanted me gone since the day I arrested his nephew for cheating at cards. This is his opportunity." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "He's given me an ultimatum through a back channel. They will drop the proceedings if I agree to certain terms." "What terms?" she asked, dreading the answer. "That I turn your contract over to him. He says he has a suitable family in mind for you to work for. Or," he added, his voice hardening, "that I put you on the next stagecoach east, send you back where you came from." The bottom fell out of Eleanor's world. To be handed over to Thompson would be a nightmare. To be sent back east would be to return in shame to a life of destitution and familial disappointment that she had risked everything to escape. But to stay would cost Jed his livelihood, his home, the very structure of the life he had built here. "You should send me away," she said, the words tasting like ash. "You can't lose your job because of me. You've done more than enough." She couldn't meet his eyes. Jed was silent for a long moment, studying her bowed head. The woman who had stood on that auction block, terrified and alone, was now willing to sacrifice her own safety for his. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had thought he was protecting her, but somewhere along the way, she had started protecting him, too. They had built something here in this dusty office, something far more real than the town's petty moralizing. He would not allow Thompson and his cronies to tear it down. He rose from his chair and walked over to stand before her. He reached out and, with a gentleness that startled her, placed a finger under her chin, tilting her face up to his. "There's a third option," he said, his voice low and intense. "The council's main objection is that our arrangement is improper, unsanctioned." He took a deep breath, the air seeming to catch in his chest. "We could sanction it. We could make it proper, according to their own rules." Her eyes widened, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" "I mean a marriage, Eleanor," he said, the word hanging in the air between them, momentous, and terrifying. A marriage of convenience. In name only. It would be a contract just like the one I bought, but it would be one they could not break. It would give you my name, my protection, legally and irrevocably. They could not touch you, and they could not use you to remove me from my office. He was offering her everything. A name, a home, permanent safety. It was a calculated, tactical move in his war with the council, a shield he was offering to raise for her benefit. But as she looked into his eyes, his serious, steady, gray eyes, she saw something more than tactics. She saw a deep, unwavering resolve. She saw a man willing to bind his life to hers to keep her safe. The reclusive, solitary sheriff was offering to end his solitude for her. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, shattering gratitude. In that moment, she trusted him completely, not just with her safety, but with her future. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. Yes, Jedediah. It was the first time she had used his given name. It felt solid and real, a promise. A decision had been made. They would not run. They would not bow. They would stand their ground, together. The church bell tolled, not for Sunday service, but for a public reckoning. The wooden pews were packed, the air thick with sanctimonious whispers and the scent of mothballs and self-righteousness. Mayor Thompson stood at the pulpit, a grimly satisfied smirk on his face, ready to preside over the downfall of Sheriff Stone. The entire town of Dust Devil Creek was there to watch the spectacle. Just as Thompson was about to bring his gavel, a repurposed bung starter, down to call the meeting to order, the heavy church doors swung open. A collective gasp swept through the congregation. Jedediah Stone stood in the entryway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. Beside him, holding his arm, was Eleanor Vance. She was not the cowering, defeated woman from the auction. She wore a simple, clean dress, her hair neatly braided and tied with the red ribbon he had given her. Her head was held high, her expression calm, though Jed could feel the fine tremor in the hand that rested on his arm. He gave her hand a slight, reassuring squeeze. They were no longer the solitary sheriff and his ward. They were a united front. They walked down the central aisle, the whispers dying in their wake, replaced by a stunned, open-mouthed silence. The sound of Jed's boots on the wooden floorboards was the only noise, each step a deliberate, defiant beat. They did not take a seat in the pews. They walked all the way to the front and stopped directly before the pulpit, facing Thompson. The mayor's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of sputtering confusion. "Sheriff, this is a closed meeting of the town council to discuss your conduct. I'm aware of what it's about, Thompson," Jed said, his voice clear and carrying to the furthest corners of the church. "And since my conduct seems to be the town's primary concern, I thought it best we address it. Publicly." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the pews, the curious, the hostile, the few who looked merely ashamed to be there. "You people," he began, his voice resonating with an authority that had nothing to do with his badge and everything to do with the conviction behind his words. "You stood by in a saloon and watched as this woman was put up on a block to be sold like a head of cattle. You called it settling an account. You debated her worth in dollars and cents. You saw a piece of property, an inconvenience to be disposed of." He paused, letting the weight of his accusation settle over the silent room. Eleanor felt a surge of strength from his words. He was not just defending her, he was indicting them. "I bought her contract," Jed continued, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the crowd in. "Not for labor. Not for the reasons your filthy minds have been whispering about in the street. I did it because it was the only decent thing to do in a town that had forgotten the meaning of the word. I offered her shelter because she was a human being in need of it. And for that, you call my morals into question?" He took a step closer to the pulpit, his eyes locked on the mayor's. "You talk about propriety, Thompson. You, who orchestrated that shameful spectacle. You talk about the spirit of the law. Is the spirit of the law to humiliate, to degrade, to profit from another's misfortune? No. The law is meant to protect the vulnerable from the powerful. A lesson you and this council seem to have forgotten. Thompson's face was a mottled shade of red and white. This is outrageous. You have no right. I have every right. Jed cut him off, his voice like the crack of a whip. I'm the law in this town. But today, I am not just here as the sheriff. He turned to Eleanor, and the hardness in his face softened, replaced by a raw, profound sincerity that stunned the onlookers into absolute stillness. In front of the entire town, he took her other hand, holding both of hers in his. This is Eleanor Vance, he said, his voice ringing with pride. A woman of more courage and character than anyone else in this room. And you will no longer refer to her as my contract or my situation. You will refer to her as my wife. A wave of shock rippled through the church. It was more potent than a gunshot. Jed did not release her hands. He looked down at her, his gaze holding hers, the rest of the world fading away. The marriage of convenience, the tactical maneuver, had melted away in the heat of his fierce defense. What was left was something true and undeniable. Eleanor, he said, his voice for her alone now, though the whole town was his witness. I asked you to marry me to protect you. But I'm asking you again now, in front of God and all these people, because my life has been a silent, empty room for 5 years, and you have filled it with light. Will you be my wife? The tears that had threatened earlier now fell freely down Eleanor's cheeks, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The shame of the auction, the fear of the whispers, the weight of her past, it was all washed away by this man's astounding public declaration of her worth. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent church. Yes, Jed, I will. Jedediah Stone, the reclusive sheriff, leaned down and kissed his bride. It was not a passionate kiss, but one of promise, of profound respect, and of a new beginning forged in the fire of adversity. Mayor Thompson stood at the pulpit, his mouth agape, his power broken, rendered utterly irrelevant by a simple act of courage and love. The town of Dust Devil Creek had gathered to witness a man's fall from grace. Instead, they had just witnessed his salvation. They walk out of the church and into the golden light of the late afternoon, leaving the stunned silence and shattered prejudices behind them. The walk back to the sheriff's office is different this time. No one whispers. No one glares. The people of Dust Devil Creek simply watch them go, their faces a mixture of awe and grudging respect. They are no longer the sheriff and the auction woman. They are Mr. and Mrs. Stone. Inside their small home, the door closes on the outside world, shutting out the dust and the gossip and the town that judged them. A profound quiet settles in the room, but it is a new kind of quiet. It is not the silence of loneliness or unspoken tension, but the deep, peaceful silence of a sanctuary finally secured. Eleanor moves to the window and looks out at the vast, empty plains stretching to the horizon. It is still a harsh and unforgiving landscape, but it no longer looks lonely to her. It looks like a place of possibility. Jed comes to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid anchor. He doesn't speak, but he reaches out and takes her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand is rough and calloused, the hand of a man who has known hardship, but its touch is gentle, protective. A promise. She turns her head to look at him, and for the first time, she gives him a full, genuine smile. It reaches her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows there. It is a smile of relief, of gratitude, and of a deep and burgeoning affection. He returns it with a small, quiet smile of his own, a sight so rare it feels like a miracle. The lines of grief around his eyes seem to have lessened, replaced by a quiet contentment. The auction contract, the document that had defined and tormented her, is a ghost. It has been replaced by a marriage certificate, but more than that, it has been replaced by a covenant of the heart, forged not by law or convenience, but by mutual respect and a fierce, unexpected love. He looks at the woman standing beside him, her hand in his, the red ribbon in her hair a small, bright flag of defiance and hope. He had paid $50 in a dusty saloon, thinking he was intervening in an injustice. He knows now that he wasn't just buying a contract. He was reclaiming his own life. And together, they stand at the window, watching the sun set on their first day, the quiet promise of all their tomorrows stretching out before them. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.